They say a phone call is harmless. Just words, just a voice on the line. But in some neighborhoods, a call to the police can become a loaded gun. This is a story about a man who followed every rule, minded his business, and still became a target. A story about power, prejudice, and a lie told with confidence, because the liar believed the system would back him up. And it almost did. Almost. Malcolm Rivers had lived on Hawthorne Lane for just over 8 months. Long enough to learn which houses left their porch lights on all night. Long enough to know who waved and who didn't. Long enough to feel the quiet judgment that lingered behind curtains whenever he stepped outside. 38, Malcolm was not flashy. He worked as a civil engineer for the city, left home every morning at 6:45, and came back around the same time every evening. No loud music, no parties, no trouble. He bought his home after years of saving. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every sacrifice stacking brick by brick until he could finally say, "This is mine." But to some people on Hawthorne Lane, Malcolm didn't look like he belonged. Across the street lived Richard Collins, 62, retired, former HOA board member, the kind of man who believed his neighborhood was a kingdom and he was its silent ruler. Richard watched Malcolm the way one watches a stray dog wander into a manicured yard. Suspicious, annoyed, offended. The first complaint came 3 weeks after Malcolm moved in. "Do you know if that man actually owns that house?" Richard asked another neighbor, loud enough for Malcolm to hear while unloading groceries. Malcolm said nothing. The second complaint came when Malcolm installed a security camera. "Feels threatening," Richard told the HOA. "Like he's watching us." Malcolm said nothing. The third complaint came when Malcolm's younger brother visited for a weekend. "There are unfamiliar men loitering," Richard said, dialing a number he knew by heart. Malcolm said nothing, because Malcolm believed silence was dignity. He believed that if he stayed calm, stayed polite, stayed invisible enough, eventually the tension would fade. He was wrong. It happened on a Saturday morning. Malcolm was in his driveway, hood up, hands greasy as he worked on his car. The sun was barely up. Birds chirped. The neighborhood was quiet. Then he heard it. Sirens. 2 police cruisers turned onto Hawthorne Lane and rolled to a stop in front of his house. Malcolm straightened slowly, heart tightening. Officers stepped out, hands near their belts. Scanning. "Sir," one officer said, voice firm, "step away from the vehicle." Malcolm froze for half a second, then complied. "What's going on?" he asked calmly. "We received a call about a suspicious individual attempting to break into a car," the officer replied. Malcolm blinked. "This is my car. This is my house." Across the street, Richard Collins stood on his porch, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. Malcolm noticed him immediately. Of course, the officers asked for ID. Malcolm handed it over, then proof of residence, then more questions. How long had he lived there? Why was he working on the car? Did he have any tools inside the house? Each question felt less like procedure and more like accusation. Richard watched every second. He shook his head theatrically when Malcolm spoke, whispered something to another neighbor, pulled out his phone. The power imbalance was clear. One man told a story. Another man had to prove his innocence. Malcolm felt anger rise, but he swallowed it, because he knew what anger could cost him. What Richard didn't know was that Malcolm had been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. One of the officers walked back toward the cruisers to run Malcolm's information. The other stayed close. Richard crossed the street, emboldened now. "I just want everyone safe," he said loudly. "You never know these days." Malcolm looked at him for the first time directly. "Funny," Malcolm said evenly. "You never asked my name, but you felt comfortable calling the police." Richard scoffed. "If you've got nothing to hide." "I don't," Malcolm interrupted. "That's why I record everything." The officer turned. "Record." Malcolm nodded toward the camera above his garage, then toward the doorbell camera, then calmly pulled out his phone. "I also happen to work for the city," Malcolm continued. "Specifically, in infrastructure oversight. Richard's expression flickered, just slightly. Malcolm tapped his phone and turned the screen toward the officer. Security footage. Time-stamped. Clear. It showed Malcolm pulling into his driveway earlier that morning, unlocking his car, popping the hood, working quietly. Then another clip. Richard across the street, watching, dialing his phone, pointing, then audio. This man looks like he's breaking into a vehicle. He doesn't belong here. The officer's jaw tightened. The second officer returned. His demeanor changed. "Sir," he said to Malcolm, handing back his ID. "You're clear." Then he turned slowly toward Richard Collins. "Mr. Collins," the officer said, "we need to talk about misuse of emergency services." Richard's confidence drained like air from a punctured tire. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't need to. Neighbors had begun to gather. Doors opened, curtains parted, phones lifted. Richard suddenly realized he was no longer the narrator of this story. He was the subject. The officers questioned him. Why had he called? Had he verified anything? Had he spoken to Malcolm before reporting him? Richard stumbled over his words. "I just felt threatened," he said weakly. "By a man fixing his own car?" one officer asked. Silence. Then Malcolm spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but with precision. "This isn't the first time," he said. "I've documented every interaction, every complaint, every call." He handed over a folder, printed logs, HOA emails, prior police reports, each one dismissed. Pattern. The officers exchanged looks. Richard's face flushed red. He tried to laugh it off. "You're making this a race thing." Malcolm met his eyes. "You made it one the moment you decided I didn't belong." That was the moment the power shifted completely. Richard was cited for filing a false police report. But worse than the citation was the exposure. By Monday, the story had spread. A neighbor uploaded the footage online. Local news picked it up. Resident falsely reports black homeowner as suspect. The HOA issued a public apology to Malcolm. Richard resigned from the board before he was removed. Neighbors who never spoke to Malcolm suddenly waved, smiled, offered help. Malcolm didn't celebrate. He simply lived. But Richard stopped coming outside. The man who once felt entitled to police protection now avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Justice didn't shout. It stood quietly on Malcolm's driveway, holding receipts. Months later, Malcolm installed one more thing. A small plaque near his front door. It read, "This home is protected by truth." Richard moved away the following spring. No goodbye, no apology, just silence. But the neighborhood remembered. And Malcolm? He learned a powerful lesson. That dignity doesn't mean submission. That silence doesn't always protect you. And that preparation is power. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't just set you free. Sometimes, turns the tables. This story isn't just about one phone call. It's about how easily suspicion becomes a weapon, and how dangerous confidence can be when it's built on prejudice. But it's also about resilience, about knowing your worth, and about the quiet strength of being ready when lies come knocking. If the story moved you, if it made you angry, thoughtful, or proud, then you already understand the lesson. And there are many more like it. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of struggle, justice, and truth, because these stories aren't rare. They're just rarely told. And here, we tell them